All right. Well, thank you for coming for the third ALM Summit. Thank you for proving that this little experiment of having these conferences is an experiment that's worth having. And thank you for not catching an early flight home. I'm rather flattered. My job is to kind of tie it all together. And so I have this talk, Reimagining the Application Lifecycle, and I'm going to try to pull together what we've covered over the last few days. Now, Simon Sinek teaches us to start with why, so I wanted to start with why do we have an application lifecycle? And I think it's because, we've been doing this for a couple decades. I think it's because we always get in this pattern that Jez pointed out from Lean IT, where when we try to ask the customer, what do you want? And we deliver it. And we do exactly what the customer says. We get, yeah, you're doing what I asked for, but that's not exactly what I want. People are better at recognizing what's not quite right than saying what they do want. The things I'm going to cover in this talk are four. I'm going to come back to this thing that you heard about from now a number of folks. Brian mentioned it. Scott talked about it this morning. Jez talked about it yesterday. A whole bunch of people have been talking about this build, measure, learn stuff. I'll summarize that. I'll dive inside the practice and what it means. Go into the state of the industry in terms of how this has evolved. And then I'll talk about what this means for ALM reimagined. Now, Whitaker yesterday warned you that he's not a G-rated guy, and he, was trying hard to get fired. I might get fired for the content I present. So we'll have a little bit of competition as to who can touch which lightning rods. Let's start with build, measure, learn. So as Dean pointed out, and as Israel pointed out again, we're sort of now in an Agile 2.0 world. We're in the second decade. We're sort of beyond the methodology wars. We do what works. I talk about our having reached an Agile consensus in my book, and three things really as summarizing that consensus. We think in terms of a trustworthy transparency that lets us reduce waste, and that reduction of waste lets us focus on a flow of value. And pretty much everywhere you go in the mainstream, this is kind of non-controversial now. I mean, you don't find people saying in many places, no, we still need to hide that in the corner because we can't, expose what we're doing. No, we really want more waste over here. No, we don't really think customer value is what we're about. We're beyond that discussion, fortunately. And out of that consensus, we learned how to do product development better, and there's a bunch of stuff that we learned that works. So probably every talk here, almost, or 80%, whatever, you've heard of someone talking about how we do our scrums. Everyone's shown how we do our unit testing. Everyone's doing continuous integration. Everyone's talking about the benefits of small batch sizes. Everyone's got a definition of done. There's a lot of talk of exploratory testing and practice after practice after practice that helps us with better product development. And we've all focused on better product development. And we're doing better product development than we used to. Now, at the same time that we were all learning how to do better product development, and Scott alluded to this morning, this guy, Steve Blank, started teaching at Stanford based on his startup experience. Hey, stop doing product development. You need to be doing customer development. And it started with the 4 Steps to the Epiphany, and he published that now 8 years ago. And he said, before you start the product, prove that you've got something that the customer wants. And then his student Eric Ries picked this up, and Ries sort of combined this agile practice stuff with his customer development stuff, and we got Lean Startup, and now it's, we've got Lean Canvases with Ash Maurya, and it keeps going, and now we're all talking about Lean in a whole different way than we used to talk about Lean. We used to talk about Lean as reduction of waste, starting with the Taiichi Ohno tradition from Toyota, and now we're talking about Lean as in the Lean Startup business practices. And it's been this transformation that we've really seen that's just, caught like brush fire in the last 3 years or something like that, as a change in business practice. And that's led to this whole build, measure, learn, which Ries, more than anyone else, has coined. And I think at least 4 different talks have used a variation of Ries's diagram here of build, measure, learn, combined with this idea of ideas, code, and data. This is one off of his Lean Startup website, which says, okay, you build into code, measure into data, and learn into new ideas, and then you iterate through that loop as the mechanism for this customer development. Okay, so that's where all of this came from. It was Steve Blank's thing, don't do product development, do customer development, marrying with Agile, and this Agile consensus. And this has all sort of come together really, in the last 2-3 years, and that's where we are. So what is this practice, build, measure, learn? In case you didn't get it by now, and weren't paying attention when Jez talked, or Scott talked, or Brian talked, or any of the other talks. I'll give it to you in one slide. Okay. You start with a business hypothesis as a testable experiment. Okay? Hypothesis. Okay? It's a big word. Don't remember what this means? It is a conjecture. It is something you don't know. If you don't have data yet, Ries says start with a leap of faith. And you make it a testable experiment. Okay? An experiment is something that can be proven true or false. Okay? In other words, you can have 2 diametrically opposed outcomes. And you turn this experiment into a minimum viable product. Minimum meaning only enough that you need to run the experiment. Viable meaning enough that you can run the experiment, and product meaning something you can show someone, but not necessarily more than show. It can be a complete fake. Doesn't have to actually, really work. It's about the experiment. And you put the measurement mechanism into that MVP. And then somehow you deploy this so that you can measure the results. And then from those results, you get validated learning. Validated here is important. Validated means it's not guesswork. It means you were actually in front of customers, and the test was, would someone pay for this, or would someone use this in this way, or would the behavior that is desired in this experiment come through in the way you hypothesized, yes or no, and that validation lets you make a decision to persevere, do more, or to pivot, do something different. Brian yesterday referred to this as think, build, measure, learn. This is the thinking part, persevere or pivot, okay? And that leads you to your next hypothesis. And as Jez pointed out, it doesn't do you a lot of good if you only do this once. The more often you do this, the more value it has to you, because the more you learn and the more you can get out of it, okay? That's build, measure, learn. Now, let me give you some examples. Who was in Eric Zygmun's talk on data-driven decision-making? Okay, so not everyone. Eric gave lots of examples. This is I don't remember whether he actually used this one. This is an example from MSN. It's maybe roughly 2 years old. He gave lots of experience reports about doing such experiments. So on the web, it's typical to run many, many, many of these at the same time. So you go to something like MSN or Bing or Amazon or Google or what have you, and there are actually many of these running simultaneously at any time, and you have no idea. And the site that, Mick pulls up and the site I pull up may not be the same because of how those things are getting served. But this particular experiment was, how should search history be surfaced in order to increase user engagement? Okay, so there's a search box at the top, which you see on the screen, and there were a couple variations that were tried in order to show recent searches under the little MSN thing. And as you can see, this is the old style of MSN. And would that increase repeat visits? And MSN is an ad-driven site in its business model. It goes off ad revenue, so repeat visits and revenue are important. Okay, so they ran the experiment. And what they found is that by adding recent search history under the box, when they measured, made absolutely no difference in revenue. And it led to a decline in page views. Interesting. So you think about that loop. So do you pivot and say, that's a dumb idea. Let's not do that and show search history? Well, this is an illustration of one of the things that happens typically when you introduce a change. Your users don't like it. However, it also led to an unexpected discovery, because the measurement is not just of the one thing in the hypothesis, and this is the difference between the measurement and the validated learning. It increased repeat visits from users. So it's something you want to persevere, because you in fact get more people coming back more often. So the hypothesis as stated and the validated learning from the experiment were actually somewhat different. This is a frequent outcome that you get in this situation, which leads you to start thinking about, well, what kind of measurement do I actually need to do? And leads you to change how you start thinking about, well, what am I really after in how I state those experiments, and how do I measure? And indeed, the culture that you need to create is one in which you're running lots of these experiments. This is a chart that, from the same report I grabbed that example out of, which shows 57 experiments that were run over a year. That led to, over that time, a 12% click-through increase. Okay, now about 80% of the experiments had negative results, in the sense of, we made this change, it made things worse. Okay, but unless you have the courage to do the experimentation, and it's okay to do stuff that doesn't work, you don't gain the validated learning. And the point is, the validated learning is what you are getting here, and validated learning is important, and you have to do that experimentation and accept that that's what you're after. This idea of experimentation is becoming a way of life, to the extent that you have sites like whichtest1.com. It's not that it's a great site, but there's a test of the week, and you get to try your intuition, okay? Hey, which one of these is going to do better? And you get to see all these wild examples of people running A/B tests. We have a saying here, we're not as smart as our users, we test. So that's the practice. Now let's talk about the state of the industry. Is this just for startups? Is this just, all these, websites, these little guys? Well, here's where I'm probably going to get fired. Jason talked about the modern application architecture and, loosely coupled systems and how we're starting to do things. Brian talked about development teams becoming more distributed. Simon Bennett gave a great talk on, new contracting models that can be possible with Agile to let us actually work productively with each other across company boundaries. And of course, we're all leveraging open source and different technologies more readily, which is why you saw the announcements around the parallel support for centralized version control and DVCS through Git as part of what we're doing, all as industry trends. Other industry trends are happening too. If you're a startup, funding models have changed. You can't get funding from investors if you're. This is a great blog post. I think this is Steve Forte's post from a few months ago. Have a great idea for a startup? Don't seek funding. Again, customer development. But in the enterprise, the same thing's happening, matching this change in application models. It's those systems of engagement that are getting funded out there in the marketing organization or the other business division, not in central IT. And those models are changing. And all of this is happening with these, devices that are with multiple form factors, mobile, tablets, what have you, on these services, on public and hybrid clouds, and they're all being enabled by all of this source of data underneath. Now, these startups are teaching this pattern, and are they the only ones? Well, even for those of you here from Brazil, thank you very much, and Germany, and France, and the rest of the world, I think you know we had a presidential election. And I think probably everyone knows who won. On the day of the election, November 6th, every newspaper, every major website, CNN, whatever, was talking about how close this was. 146 undecided electoral votes. Okay. All those gray states, the 11 undecided states, close election, too close to call, blah, 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 blah. And it was really, it was tense, it was a cliffhanger, all this kind of stuff. It was so close that at one point, Team Romney displayed their victory page, inviting people to the inauguration where Romney was going to deliver his inaugural address. That came down quickly, but it was worth noting that that was one view of reality. Now, there have been a lot of postmortems, and I intentionally called them that rather than retrospectives, about what happened with the Romney campaign. Team Romney developed this thing called Orca, a system that went live on Election Day to support the volunteers. Live on Election Day. Did I say that? Now imagine this, on a national scale, the volunteers didn't know where to pick up their login credentials. When the ones who did get their credentials got through the 60-page PDF of how to use it and did start logging in, Comcast, the ISP, thought this was a denial of service attack. Shut the site down. The headquarters in Boston had no data, didn't know what was going on. There was Karl Rove on CNN saying, no, I don't believe you that the election's actually been called. It was really quite bizarre. And this all happened, and, there was this whole story about how close this was. And the weird thing is that the data was available for months in the public eye that was telling a very different story. So who knows Nate Silver? Probably most of many of you. Okay, so Nate Silver has the blog 538, which now belongs to the New York Times. 538, if you don't know, is the number of electoral votes. He got 50 out of 50 states predicted in both 2008 and 12, and trended the probability of who would win on a weekly basis starting in May, and tracked, you can see at the bottom, it's a picture from his blog, the relative probabilities, blue being the Democrats and red being the Republicans by our weird convention where Republicans share the same color as the former Soviet flag. And he does this with a huge Excel spreadsheet in which he keeps a statistical model using the relative accuracies of different data sources of polling that he tracks based on their historical counts. Came within 0.1% of the actual popular vote, by the way. And trended this all along. I mean, and there is no point in his trend at which the red and blue lines cross, and they start diverging radically toward the end. And his book, Signal and the Noise, actually doesn't really, there's only one chapter on the political prediction. It's a great story. It's a great analysis of where we have gotten better about prediction and where we haven't. Starting with baseball, which is where he started with his baseball model, Pacoda, and then he got the idea of, hey, how come someone doesn't do this for politics? And then he has a great analysis of why we've gotten better at figuring out where hurricanes will make landfall, but not earthquakes. So this was all in the public eye. Now, why was this happening, and why was the Obama for America team increasing the spread so consistently over that period? Also, by now, it's been widely reported. Well, there was a team of data analysts and developers who were primarily in Chicago, who were working away at this, running experiments as a way of life. So, for example, every time the Obama campaign sent an email, and they sent a lot of them, it got tested on average 18 times before it got sent on a mass scale. Who knows what the most successful subject line for a fundraising email was? Anyone? It's Bush's fault. It's Bush's fault. Good guess, but no. Hey. H-E-Y. Go figure. Okay? Who would guess that that's the most successful subject line, right? None of them did. They had office betting pools about which ones would work. No one guessed that. They just experimented. And it turns out that was the most successful one. And there were huge differences in performance between the poorly performing ones and the good performing ones. And they just picked the ones that worked. Okay? And they kept testing and would quickly vary them. Okay? Harper Reed the CTO of the Obama campaign, would drive this team following modern practices of DevOps and build, measure, learn. So, for example, they would do their own measurements, twice weekly running their own polls because they didn't believe in the publicly available sources, using their own random sampling to test their effectiveness, and then doing a series of 60-some thousand Monte Carlo simulations to allocate the volunteers to where to go the next morning, okay, using their own software engineers whom Reed had hired into the campaign. And they were using the new app pattern. So, you know, they knew they had to reach devices. 25% of the traffic, they realized, was coming from mobile devices. So just doing it as a website was problematic, so they experimented with this thing called Quick Donate, where you registered, and then you could do the equivalent of one-click purchase on Amazon or whatever, okay, to just do a quick donate. Turns out those donors gave 4 times as often and 3 times as much because they could just donate on their phones. Turns out it was Whitaker drinking all that beer, okay? You know, sees something on CNN in the bar, and there was a sufficient level of anxiety, and it's now all of a sudden an app. Well, there you are, using the new channel and the new device, and that's the new way of doing things. It's an app, and it's social, and it's plugged into an opportunity to also recommend your Facebook friends. Now, this was done in-house. Who spent more money? Obama for America did this in-house. Harper Reed hired these folks into as employees into Chicago, into the Obama for America campaign. Team Romney outsourced their Orca system and spent 7 times as much for the system that Comcast thought was a denial of service. Okay. That's the new way of work. The whole model turned on its head. Now, interestingly, it took 18 months for Obama for America. In the first 9 months, there wasn't a lot to show because they were focusing on the APIs first, the infrastructure that Israel was talking about, and had to get those working. And then they started seeing the realization. I think we'll see the next round of campaigns start 30 months ahead of time. There was also an attention to anti-fragility. So I don't know, Jez has blogged about this. I don't think this was, he mentioned this in his talk. Nassim Nicholas Taleb gave us the concept of black swans, weird events that happen that unusually, like the financial collapse, the tsunami, the World Trade Center, not easily predictable, but enormously consequential, positive or negative. One of the things that Reed did is disaster drills. They called them game days. What happens when our data centers, which were all public cloud, go out? what happens when the bulldozer cuts the cable. And they would rehearse for this. When Hurricane Sandy hit, their East Coast data center went out, and they didn't go down because they had rehearsed it all. Okay. I won't ask you to think about your own disaster recovery plans in your rehearsals. Okay. Anti-fragility is one of the things you get from practicing good DevOps. You do it all the time, and you can recover from things that go wrong because you can just keep rolling forward, and you have built-in redundancy that allows you to just handle these unexpected events. You fix to root cause. So that was not a startup. That was not in a garage in San Francisco, and that was, albeit Ars Technica in many of the citations, it was also covered by the national news media. And will get a lot of attention, and I think was observed by many CEOs. If you need to get attention on why we should do something differently, and you need an example of how we need to change our life cycle and what the results might be, there's an example. So what does this mean for a reimagined life cycle? Well, I think we've had a few waves of learning. Israel doesn't talk about it anymore, but he's the guy who taught us originally about technical debt. And I think our first wave of learning was get rid of the technical debt. Because until you do that, you've got all these impediments that, just sort of stand in your way, and until you bulldoze through the technical debt, you never get past them. The second wave of learning was then focus on the flow of value as understood by the customer. The third wave was now address the cycle time so that you can learn more and more frequently, and with shortened cycle time, build in continuous feedback. And build in feedback at many points through the cycle. So, last year I think I talked about two metrics that I think we need to put into the life cycle. Cycle time explicitly, how long does it take us to get from an idea in the backlog to deployed software in customers' hands? And MTTR, how long from an event in production to a fix of the root cause deployed and working in customers' hands? And I think we now realize that there's another one, which we're starting to talk about, which is how do we get experiments and validated learning into the backlog, how quickly with each cycle, and build that up. That's, in simpler terms, a virtuous improvement cycle. So if we look at all of this together, it starts with the reduction of waste, with trustworthy transparency, the flow of value, the shortened cycle time, the continuous feedback, and from there, a continuous business improvement. You heard Brian talk about how we're doing that with our service, tfs.visualstudio.com, and how we've gone to a model of deploying at the end of every sprint there, and deploying for heterogeneous development. And I hope you all have accounts there by now. Certainly the dashboard showed that a bunch were created yesterday. And we do that because we know there's no place like production. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take some questions, and I'm also happy to let you out early. Yeah.
Talk a little bit about, build, measure, learn.
Yeah.
Very empirical, which is, stuff that Agile has been talking about for ages. I'm just wondering if that might naturally lead to build, measure, learn, build, measure, learn, build, measure, learn, predict. And whether it might naturally lead to, we've got all these numbers now that we can more accurately estimate what our people are going to do when it comes to developing systems.
Steve's question is, we've got build, measure, learn, and does that lead us to prediction? And can we more accurately estimate what people are going to do? Do you mean what users are going to do?
No, our development teams.
What our development teams are going to do. I hope that we continue to get smarter at learning what we do and don't need to do. And I hope we get smarter at recognizing patterns where we can, reuse things, and we continue to get smarter at reuse. And in fact, I think that is happening. One of the things that is happening in this API economy is that we are in fact, building more on each other's stuff. Which is not just a build, measure, learn thing. It is also our ability to experiment more. I think that the more interesting question about prediction, and where a lot of people are trying to go, is around machine learning. So we are getting a lot of data now from all of this usage, and can we apply better Bayesian reasoning to it to understand what behavior is likely there? I think there's both the the art and science of the development side of it are increasing, and the science is getting better, but I think the art is getting as necessary too. So they're both there, and I think it's changing. So I mean, was it Jez or was it someone else who said, the best thing you can do is not write the line of code?
That was Jez.
Because then you have to maintain it.
We've got one from the peanut gallery here.
Sam, am I allowed to ask? I am. So Sam, can everything be built in this way, or does this only really lend itself well to systems of engagement? Because I wouldn't like to do a build, measure, learn for a plane. Well, I wouldn't be the test pilot. You know, is it possible that certain types of systems don't lend itself well to this?
Well, so if you look at Boeing, for example, and the changes, Boeing might not be the best example this week, given what's happening with their batteries.
Well,
although
they've learned a lot.
I will blame their supplier. But if you look at the number of physical prototypes that are being created in manufacturing processes for aircraft or automobiles or other such large machines that I think, in fact, you will see that some of this is happening there. Okay, the types of experiments being done are different. Okay, and there it's not, you know, user behavior necessarily that you're doing the experiment on, but absolutely this is about trying to shorten a learning cycle, trying to do things with testable hypotheses, trying to componentize in such a way. There's a wonderful book that is now probably 15 years old called Design Thinking. That was effectively about componentization across industries that I think is a precursor to this. So, yeah.
But the minimum product is significantly bigger. I mean, it's a different size. It isn't necessarily 2 weeks or a month. It becomes much bigger potentially to get that experiment, to understand that experiment.
Yeah, of course. But I mean, but show me the industry where people are not dealing with trying to shorten time to market, are not trying to deal with faster change, are not experimenting with new materials, are not trying to deal with this type of innovation as a new way of life. We're fortunate in software in that for us it's actually, it is just simply easier than in things that have lots of heavy material that you have to move around or complicated chemistry.
We have any more questions?
I can't see.
I think we'll just say thank you. Sam?
Thank you very much.